Before the summit even begins, a draft agreement is already out. Our correspondent Brian Carter joins us now live from Brussels. And Brian, what do we know so far about the draft summit discussion topics that are already outlined?
Good morning, Belle. The EU leaders are expected to arrive in the buildings here behind me as of 1:30 this afternoon, with discussions to last way into the night because, as you said, the question of migration is really high on the agenda. From the draft document that some media outlets have mentioned some of the points in it, we know that they want to increase the money to the Africa Trust Fund and pay the next tranche to the EU-Turkey refugee deal, which are uncontroversial measures. The most controversial points that they will talk about is first, the disembarkation platforms, second, the reform of the Dublin regulation, and third, the number of returned migrants. Now, first, the disembarkation platforms. We talked about it on this show. It will be these platforms outside the EU for people that have been either caught at sea or stopped on their way to Europe, where they will stay for the time for their asylum application to be processed. Now, the draft agreement that was leaked says that this will be done with respect to international law, but some human rights groups we talked to said that they have doubts about this, and they're afraid that these will turn just into mass detention camps. The second point, the Dublin regulation, this regulation that says that the first country of entry is the country where the asylum seeker should process his application. Now, nobody thinks that an agreement will be found today. They've been trying to reform this regulation for years, but some countries here in Europe, mostly in the Visegrad group, do not want to hear about asylum seekers. And third, the number of returned migrants. Now, different numbers have floated. The latest shows that they want to double the number of returned migrants, which will probably mean more arrests across Europe and mass deportations of migrants to their country of origin. Now, all this comes at a time, we need to remember, when there is no migration crisis in Europe. Only 40,000 people have made it to Europe this year alone. It's half the number of the same period last year. What we do have, on the other hand, is a humanitarian crisis with 1,000 people that died at sea this year alone, 3,000 people last year. And what we do have as well is a political crisis with far-right parties that are on the rise everywhere across Europe, and traditional parties and institutions trying to respond to this rise by taking measures against migrants. Belle?
Well, what else should we be looking out for during this summit, very quickly, Brian?
Well, we know that they will talk about Brexit, about security, about budget. Donald Tusk has mentioned that he wanted to talk about trade as well, following, of course, the tariffs that were imposed by Donald Trump on steel and aluminum. He said that apparently EU leaders need to prepare for the worst case scenario. But what we're also looking at is really the mood here in Brussels, which is really grim. I mean, if you read some of the headlines that have been published over the last couple of days, they talk about the end of the EU, that this is a moment of truth for the European Union, etc. Because we have talks about closing borders, which will hurt the Schengen Agreement, which is one of the cornerstone of the EU construction. So there's a lot of expectations for this summit, but you have to remember this is not the first time we talk about these doomsday scenario, and there were always agreements that were found in the end. But with elections coming up in May 2019, emotions run really high here in Brussels. Belle?